Uh, hey everyone. So welcome to the PEDro Scale refresher webinar. My name is Nick and I've been one of the moderators for the PEDro Raiders Facebook group alongside Gerardo. And I think the plan for today is I think Geraldine might speak at the start for a bit and then we'll have Mark to talk afterwards and we'll probably have time for questions and potentially a discussion afterwards as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Nicholas, and thanks so much, everybody, for coming. It's wonderful that you've made time to come to this really special event. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully, you can see that. Um, so, what I wanted to do is just to give a quick introduction just about the PEDro Scale refresher webinar that we're going to have. And Mark will be talking in detail about the PEDro Scale, of course. But I was wanting to pose the question, which PEDro items most commonly need a consensus rating? And I was thinking about just with regards to 2025, because of the current raters that are here. And I did a little search on the PEDro interface and I came up with this information. Now it's quite information heavy, but I looked at the records that had been finalized just in this year from January the 1st to October the 1st. And all PEDro raters have finalized 1,568 articles, which is a massive contribution to the database. So thank you, everybody. But what I wanted to do is to go through some of these numbers. And so we've got down on the left-hand side all the items, the criteria, so what each of them describe, the numbers that needed a consensus rating, and a percentage of the total number that needed the consensus rating. And what we see is that for items 1A and 1 and 9, about a third of those articles all needed a consensus rating. We can see for concealed allocation, for baseline comparability, for item 7, blinding of assessors, and adequate follow-up, so more than 85% follow-up. There are around 20% of the articles that need a consensus rating. So I thought this would be a nice introduction to Mark's talk on giving us a refresher on each of the items. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll hand over to Mark.
Thank you, Geraldine. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing just the slide. Great. So thanks everyone for coming to join this session. What I'm going to cover are some general issues that kind of apply across all the items on the scale. And then when you were surveyed, for each item on the scale, there was at least one or two of you who wanted it discussed. So I'm going to discuss all of the items, despite what Geraldine just showing you that some are rated much better than others. And then at the end, this will answer a lot of the questions that you submitted in that little survey, but there are a couple of questions that it won't answer, so I'll address them. I've prepared a few slides to answer them at the end. And then if you still have further questions, I'm happy to, we should have plenty of time to discuss those. So the first general issue that I'm going to cover is all items are rated according to the information presented in the paper. So that means if the paper refers to or cites another paper, like a published protocol, or maybe this is a secondary report and it makes reference to the primary report, you do not use that other paper. You just rate based on what is in the paper that you've been sent. However, if the paper refers to supplementary files like an appendix or an addendum or supplemental files, these should be included in the PDF that you receive from PEDro. So scroll down if it says, oh, this information's in Appendix 1, scroll down and you should find Appendix 1. And you should include any of those supplementary files in your rating. If the supplementary files are not included, we don't want you to waste your time running around looking for them. Just click the Contact PEDro button and just say, the paper mentions a supplementary file, but it's not included. And then please cite the trial ID. So it's our job to run around and find those files and make sure they're included and send the thing back to you. So don't waste time looking for supplementary files if they're not there. But also try not to waste our time. You already know the trial ID, so include it when you send your message via the Contact PEDro button. The next general issue is points are only awarded when a criterion is clearly satisfied. If, for example, the text mentions that a certain number of subjects were included in the study, but it never specifies that no one dropped out, it doesn't specify that people necessarily did drop out, there's just no information, then this would score no, because it's possible that there were dropouts and the authors forgot to mention it. The information must be explicit, it must be clearly stated with no ambiguity. If on a literal reading of the paper, it's possible that a criterion was not satisfied, then it rates no. Okay, the next general issue, several of the items on the scale refer to key outcomes. So when you are looking for these in the paper, they're typically labeled the primary outcomes, the key outcomes, or the main outcomes, and they are usually the best measure of the clinical effectiveness of the intervention. So if those terms are not used, you need to use your clinical judgment to decide which outcomes provide the most important measure of whether the intervention is clinically effective. Sometimes feasibility studies and cost-effectiveness studies have key outcomes related to other things, related to adherence or acceptability or safety or economic analyses. You should still seek to rate the outcomes that provide the most important measure of whether the treatment is clinically effective. So feasibility studies and cost-effectiveness studies, they have their place in the evidence, but what the PEDro scale is rating is it giving you enough information to determine the clinical effects and to know whether to apply the treatment to patients or not. And so that's what we're measuring. And feasibility studies and cost-effectiveness studies that's not their goal, and so they may not achieve that very well, and so they score lower on the PEDro scale. It's not saying to those researchers that they did the wrong thing, it's just saying that this study doesn't, if it doesn't include any measures of the clinical effect of the intervention, then it's not going to be as useful for that purpose. The next general issue is when an item is met, record the location of that information in the paper in detail. So be more explicit than just saying, oh, it's in the method section. Sometimes the method section is 2.5 pages long. And if your ratings go for consensus rating because you disagree with another rater, then you've spent a lot of time finding where in the paper you think this information is, and you can save that time for the consensus person by explaining exactly where in the paper you think you found this information. So that might mean you might use subheadings within the methods section, or you might use page numbers and paragraph numbers, even line numbers, or you might have a table number or a figure number. So table 2, line 7, here's where I think the difference in baseline comparability comes. So try and direct the consensus rater directly to where you found that information. If the consensus rater sends explicit feedback, then you need to try and learn from that feedback. Some items are subjective, particularly the baseline comparability one. So if you and another rater disagree, you're very unlikely to get any message from the consensus rater to say that you haven't used the tool properly. We understand that some things are a bit borderline, and that's fine. But if the consensus rater sends you feedback, it means that you clearly haven't used the scale properly. And so you need to try and learn from that feedback, maybe go and look at that item and read the definition again and make sure you've understood how the thing should be scored. So they're all the general issues. Are there any questions about any of those before we move on to the individual items? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. I can't see everyone on my gallery, but I will presume that it's okay and we'll move on. Anyway, there'll be time at the end. So item 1 on the PEDro scale has 2 parts. So we need the source of the participants, and part 2 is the eligibility criteria. So in judging the source needs to include a location. So it might be participants were recruited from 5 hospitals in Sydney, or recruited from these very specific universities or sites or clinics or hospitals. It also needs to sort of explain the method. So, participants were approached by surgeons in preoperative orthopedic clinics at those locations, or participants were recruited via advertisements on the radio and in the newspaper in Sydney. So you need the method and the location, so that if someone wanted to replicate the study, they'd be able to recruit participants in the same way or in a comparable way. So that's the first part of item 1. The second part of item 1 is eligibility criteria. And eligibility criteria typically consist of both inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. Sometimes a trial might not have any exclusion criteria. Once they've defined their inclusion criteria, anyone who meets those criteria is eligible to participate in the study. If that's what they did, that's fine. If the paper states whatever the eligibility criteria were, it should score a yes. There's not really a minimum number of eligibility criteria. I know that the explanation of that item says the paper must provide a list of eligibility criteria, which kind of implies multiple, but I can't imagine a trial would only ever have one eligibility criterion. But if they did, then that would be a list of 1, and that would be acceptable, so long as they've clearly explained all the criteria. So if they said, having multiple sclerosis was one of our inclusion criteria, and then they never explained what the other inclusion criteria were, that would be a problem. That would score no. But otherwise, provided they explained whatever eligibility criteria they used, then it's a yes. Moving on to item 2, randomization. So you're probably familiar with this definition. If the report states that allocation was random, the precise method of randomization doesn't need to be specified. We take the authors at their word and we score it a yes. However, if the authors then go on and give further information that indicates that it wasn't random, then we score it a no. Procedures such as tossing a coin or rolling a dice should be considered random, whereas not quite random, quasi-random, intended to be random, but not true random are things like allocation by hospital number, allocation by birth date, alternation, and so on. So let's try a couple of others. So this first one is, this is a 3-arm trial. So the researcher has an opaque brown paper bag, and they have 3 ping pong balls, 3 table tennis balls with A, B, and C written on them. And the researcher looks away, rummages around in the bag and pulls out a ball and says, okay, you're in group B, pops that back. The next patient comes in and they do the same thing. Okay, you're in group C. Is that a random allocation procedure or quasi-random? So one person's nodding for random. What do other people think? Okay, that's pretty random. Each person who comes in the trial has the same chance of ending up in group A, B, and C as every other person that comes into the trial. So that's fine. Okay, what about this one? It's another 3-arm trial. If you present at A&E on a Monday, you're in one group, Wednesday, another group, Friday, another group. Okay, someone's shaking their head. Do you want to unmute yourself and tell us why?
It's not random, it's a quasi-randomization. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. So there could be differences in how busy the emergency department is on different days of the week, how long the person has had their problem before they presented at A&E. The doctors might be quite sympathetic on a Monday and quite dismissive on a Friday. There could be systematic differences and that could cause systematic differences in the groups. One more point on randomization, and that is judging eligibility of a trial to be on PEDro, that involves making an assessment about randomization, but that's different to assessing item 2, randomization on the PEDro scale. So judging whether a paper is eligible to be on PEDro, we index randomized and quasi-randomized or intended to be random studies. So both types of trials are eligible for PEDro, but then when you come to rate item 2, was there true randomization? It has to be the true randomization, not quasi-randomization, to score yes. So don't get those two things mixed up. Okay, item 3, concealed allocation. So in rating this, try and imagine that you were the researcher about to enroll a patient in this trial. When you read the methods, is there any interpretation of that text that would let you foresee which group the patient would end up in if you decided to enroll them in the trial? And if there's any, like maybe it's unclear, maybe they could, maybe they couldn't, but you're not sure, and perhaps could is a possibility, then you have to give it a no. It's only if it's perfectly clear and unambiguous that there is no way the enrolling investigator could know which group the person would end up in, then you can give it a yes. So if it says an independent off-site researcher held the random allocation list, that indicates that they're the only ones, they're independent of the other researchers in the trial, they're even off-site, they're holding the list, nobody else has the list, and therefore that's a yes, because people have to contact that researcher and say, here I'm enrolling patient number 7, John Smith, tell me which group he's randomized to, and that is then concealed allocation. A very subtle difference, but if it says an independent off-site researcher generated the randomization list, that is no guarantee. Maybe they did generate it, but then they sent it to the other researchers who had it sitting on the desk while they were recruiting patients into the study. So held, kept, retained, that is very different to just generating the list. And in the same way, a computerized random number generator generated the allocation list is no guarantee, because if a computer generates a random list, that's fine, but what if it's printed out and then given to the researchers? So that on its own is not enough. The paper still has to say that this list was somehow concealed from the enrolling investigator. Also, stratified randomization doesn't guarantee concealed allocation. So in some cases, it probably does, but we don't know for sure. So if you have, some researchers would set up a little computer program where you have to put in the patient's name and the number and then put in their stratification criteria, and then that is used. The randomization doesn't exist until those criteria go in, and then it comes back. But some authors might not like the randomization. They might go in and delete that patient from the list. So just saying that it was stratified randomization isn't a guarantee. They actually have to say somewhere in the paper that it was concealed allocation. So there are various ways that people can describe concealed allocation, and this was one of the questions that got submitted. So it might say each allocation was sealed in an opaque envelope, or allocation involved contacting a researcher who was off-site. That's also known as telephone randomization. A colleague who was otherwise uninvolved in the study generated and retained the list. So that retained, kept word is very important. A very old-fashioned term for concealed allocation is blinded allocation or masked allocation. You'll hardly ever see these terms used these days, and we prefer not to use them because of potential confusing with blinding of participants, blinding of assessors, and so on. But maybe if someone finds a very old paper one day and it's being added to PEDro decades late because we never found it originally, and you might see these terms, but hopefully you won't. And please don't use them if you're writing a paper. I'll just make that comment with my editor's hat on. Item 4 is baseline comparability. So you need two types of measures to score a yes. There has to be a baseline measure of the severity of the condition, how bad the condition is, and is there a baseline measure of some other key outcome? So we've already discussed what key outcomes are. So you need these two measures to be present. That's the first thing. Sometimes you won't get, there mightn't be any key measures at baseline. For example, if it's a pilot trial focused on safety or feasibility or adherence, in which case that scores a no. We sort of discussed this earlier in the talk. But if these two measures are present, then you need to ask yourself, are the outcomes of the groups likely to differ by a clinically important amount because of baseline differences in the characteristics of the groups? And this is a bit subjective, and we acknowledge that, but just try to think like a clinician and try to think like a researcher and draw on your experience from those two fields and try to decide with what you know about the baseline characteristics whether they are large enough to have affected the outcomes to a clinically important extent. A lot of people wonder why we use this fairly subjective definition and not look at p-values in the table of baseline characteristics. Well, I wrote a research note about that. So this research note is available free for anyone in the world in Journal of Physiotherapy, and it's called Assessing Baseline Comparability in Randomized Trials. So I recommend that you just read that. It's only like 2.5 pages long, and it's in very plain English. There's no complicated statistical terms, and that will explain it to you. Moving on to item 5, blinding of patients. So imagine the patient was exposed to each intervention in the study, even if in the actual conduct of the study they only received one. Would that patient have been able to sense a difference between the interventions if they were exposed to both of them? And that's our definition. And a lot of people aren't terribly happy about that. They think it's too high of a bar, but that is really what's necessary to stop any placebo effects, Hawthorne effects, all these other things from potential affecting the outcomes of the study. One point where some people get confused about rating is, what if it's only a baby? The participants in the studies are babies who are too young to know what a clinical trial is, let alone which group they are in. The rule still applies. If the baby was exposed to the interventions being compared in the trial and they could sense a difference between any of those treatments, they could feel a difference or hear a difference or smell a difference, whatever it is, if they could sense a difference, then we would still rate that a no. But if the participants in the study are unconscious, so maybe they are paralysed and sedated patients in intensive care, then they can be considered blinded, provided they're unconscious throughout the delivery of the intervention and the assessment of the outcome measures, and that they are unaware. They couldn't have sensed a difference between the treatments because at the time the treatments were delivered, they were unconscious. So maybe it's some post-operative, maybe changing the doing some inspiratory muscle training while the people are still paralysed and sedated and on a ventilator. Then that would be acceptable. But generally, it's pretty hard for us to blind patients, which is why so few trials on PEDro score a yes for blinding of patients. Blinding of therapists is almost exactly the same definition, except it's that imagine the therapist administered each intervention, even if they only administered one in the study, would they have been able to sense a difference in what they were administering? And if they could, then it's a no. And then item 7, blinding of assessors. So if the assessor measured patients from each group, would they be able to sense which intervention the patients had received? So, for example, if one group had strapping tape and the other group didn't, was that body region covered by some opaque plastic bag or something to cover up where the strapping tape was? Or alternatively, maybe the strapping tape was taken off and the skin was cleaned of any adhesive and there was time allowed for impressions in the surface of the skin to resolve by the time the assessor came in to do the assessment, then that would be adequate blinding. But you need to think through carefully, would an assessor have had any way to determine which treatment the participants had received? And most important of all, and I think most of you are well aware of this, if the measures are self-reported, the participant is considered the assessor. And so it's great if a paper says a blinded researcher administered the questionnaire to the participant, but still it's the participant who's answering the questionnaire. And if they're not blinded, then the assessor is not blinded. Okay, item 8, at least 85% follow-up. So typically you can rate no from information in the flow diagram, because if more than 15% of people were lost to follow-up, then they can't be measured, and therefore there wasn't at least 85% follow-up. If the flow diagram looks okay, that's great, but then you should also check the key outcomes in the results tables, because sometimes there's further missing data. So maybe 90% of people were followed up until the end of the trial, but among those 90%, another 10% had missing data on the key outcomes. They didn't fill in the questionnaire. That was the primary outcome for the trial. In that case, there's more than 20% missing data, and so that would be problematic. So you can often rate no just from the flow diagram, but you can't always rate yes. It might look good, but then you need to go ahead and check a bit further. So information from a table or a figure has to be unambiguous. So based on this flow diagram, there were 52 randomized and there were 49 followed up until the end of the trial. So that looks like a very high percentage, but you just need to go and check the results tables to see if there's any further missing data on the key outcomes. The next item is item 9, and that's intention to treat analysis. So if the paper states intention to treat analysis, then you can give it a yes, unless further information indicates that it wasn't. So some authors get a bit confused about what intention to treat analysis means, and so we need to recognize that if they give away from further description what went on, that they didn't achieve intention to treat. So other ways that they can score yes is if it explicitly states all participants were analysed in the groups to which they were originally randomised, then we can give it a yes. That's lovely. That sounds like no one was lost to follow-up and they were all analysed in the groups to which they were originally randomised. But sometimes the authors can't measure everybody. Sometimes someone's spouse unexpectedly gets a transfer to Canada and the participant in your study goes with them, or patients die and they can't be measured at the end of the trial. So patients aren't always available, but the point is if they are available, then the authors measure them and analyse them in the groups to which they were originally randomised, then you can also say yes. So it doesn't mean you have to have 100% data. It doesn't mean you have to impute data if data is unavoidably missing. But if you can measure someone, then you should measure them regardless of whether they received all the intended treatment, some of the intended treatment, none of the intended treatment, even if they received the wrong treatment, a treatment that was intended for another group in the study. None of those, what treatment they received doesn't matter at all. It's just, did they, could you measure them? And if you could measure them, then you did measure them and you analysed them in the group to which they were originally randomised. Note that the consort flow diagram often includes this information or can give you some hints about it. So here we've got a flow diagram. It's a 3-arm trial. So 20 people were allocated to active assisted and 20 people received that intervention. 20 were allocated to 21 to passive stretching and all 21 received it, and 20 to thermotherapy and all 20 received it. So that's looking really good. Then when we look down here, only 19 out of the 20 were analysed because someone got the transfer to Canada, so they were unavailable. All 21 were analysed in this group, and in this group, a couple were missing. So one person had heart disease, so maybe they had a heart attack and they weren't available to be measured, or they weren't safe to do an exercise test as part of the measuring the primary outcome. That's fine. But this last bit is a problem: frequent refusal of treatment. So that means the authors excluded this person from analysis because they didn't get the full course of treatment. And that contravenes intention to treat analysis. So even though here it looks as though everyone got the treatment, what they must mean up here is that they received some of the allocated treatment. But here they've decided to exclude someone from the analysis purely on the basis of them not receiving the full intervention. And that's not an intention to treat analysis. Again, if you are going to use information from a table or figure, it has to be unambiguous. So this example we just saw, that's unambiguous. That's clearly not intention to treat analysis. But here, this is the one we saw a couple of slides ago. It looks all okay. It looks as though the only people who weren't followed up were people who withdrew. They took themselves out of the trial. If they refused to participate further, we can't make them. And so they weren't excluded for, having poor compliance with the therapy. But what sometimes happens is maybe one person in this group didn't do any of the intervention. And so the authors analysed them in the control group, and maybe one person in the control group read the patient information statement and actually did the active intervention when they weren't supposed to. And so the authors have swapped them over. So sometimes the numbers add up, but the authors don't show you that people have crossed over. And we know authors sometimes do that. So we can't unambiguously say yes from this table. We would need one of those other phrases in the paper somewhere. So all participants were analysed in the groups to which they were originally randomised, or all available participants, which is what it would be here, because a couple of participants withdrew themselves from the study. So just those that were still available were all measured and all analysed in the group to which they were originally randomised. If you wonder why intention to treat analysis is a preferred way of doing it, then here's another research note in the Journal of Physiotherapy. So this was written by Anne Mosley and me, and it's again a very short paper, very simple clinical example, and it explains why it's preferable to the other approaches. I can discuss it a bit at the end if you've never really understood it, but I recommend reading this paper. Nearly there. Item 10, between group statistical comparisons. So here we've got continuous outcome measures. And so if you're going to make a between group statistical comparison, you can use the point measures at the end of the trial and do a between group comparison between them. Or you can use the change measures, how much the experimental group improved and the control group improved, and do a between group comparison between them. What you can't do is separate within group statistical comparisons. So you can't say, oh, there was a significant improvement in the experimental group and a non-significant improvement in the control group. That is two separate within group statistical comparisons. It's not a between group comparison. So how might a between group comparison be described in the paper? Well, it could be a p-value or a confidence interval for the between group comparison. Sometimes it's called a group by time interaction effect. It could be a mean difference between groups, a median difference between groups, a difference in proportions between groups, number needed to treat, relative risk, also known as risk ratio, odds ratio, or hazard ratio. These are all between group measures. And the last item is item 11. So this again has two parts, point measures and measures of variability. So point measures are the measures we discussed before, except here it can be that they just present, maybe they present the between group difference, but maybe they just present the effect, the point measure in one group and the point measure in the other group, and they never make the between group comparison. Provided they give you the score for each group, that's a yes for that part of item 11. And if they just give you the between group comparison, again, that's a point measure in a way. So that again counts for the first part of item 11. For the second part, variability, hopefully you see standard deviations, you might see standard errors or confidence intervals, or ranges or interquartile ranges or some other form of range. And these can be taken from a graph, from error bars from a graph, but only if it is made clear somewhere in the paper what the error bar represents. It needs to say, in a footnote to this table, error bars show standard deviations, for example. Then it's clear what the error bar represents, and then it's a valid measure of variability. For dichotomous measures, it's very much simpler. You just need the total number of participants in each group and the number within those totals that experience the outcome of interest. So that's usually pretty straightforward. So There were just a couple of questions submitted that I haven't addressed in what I've presented so far. So I'll just answer those and then I'll open it up to more general questions. So the first one was, is it possible to modify or update the PEDro scale? I'm not sure if this was sort of suggested to you as part of the questionnaire because quite a few people made comment about it, but unfortunately the answer is no. And the reasons for that are around 50,000 trials have already been rated. And if we were to make a change, we'd have to go back and re-rate 50,000 trials. And also, the PEDro scale has undergone a lot of clinometric validation. And so we've published about 8 trials showing that it is a good scale. If we made even a small change in the scale, all these validation studies would become invalid and we'd have to go back and start validating the scale again. So we don't want to do either of those things. So that's why we're happy with the scale the way it is. If you're dissatisfied with any of the items on the PEDro scale, I'm happy to discuss them during the open question time. And then another question was submitted, which is, they basically said, I get a bit confused when I'm rating crossover trials compared to parallel trials. So can we just talk through what's different about rating a crossover trial? So the main differences are item 2, participants are randomly allocated an order in which they will receive the treatment. So if it's just 2 treatments, experimental and then control, or control and then experimental. Item 3 is the concealed allocation. So the enrolling investigator is unaware of that order. When they decide the patient's going in the study, they don't know which treatment they're going to receive first. Item 4 is baseline comparability. Sometimes authors give you all the baseline. So this group received the intervention first, then they cross over and receive control. This group receives control first, and then they cross over and receive intervention. Sometimes authors give you the baseline of everybody as they were entering into the intervention period and compare that to the characteristics of everyone as they were entering the control condition. So these people just before control and these people just before control. If those things are comparable, that's fine. Give it a yes. Sometimes you just get this arm at the beginning of the whole study and you don't get extra measures there, and you just get this arm at the beginning of the whole study and not extra measures there. That's also acceptable. Pretty much however they slice and dice the data, if they give you baseline data in a crossover trial and it looks comparable, then that's acceptable. Item 8, so that's 85% follow-up. Participants need to complete both arms of the study for their data to be useful. A valid analysis of a crossover trial is paired data, and unless you've got data in both arms of the study, if you complete the first arm of the study and not the second, we can't really use the data from the first half because we can't pair it up with anything. And so you can just look at how much loss to follow-up there was across the whole study, not just the first arm. And item 9 is intended to treat analysis. So participants received the treatments in the intended order, or if they didn't, they were still analysed as though they did receive them in the correct order. And obviously that's only if they're still available. If they're unavoidably unmeasurable, they don't need to be included. But if they can be measured, they should be measured, and they should be measured as though they received the treatments as they were originally intended to receive them. So that's all the differences in rating a crossover trial. And with a cluster trial, so that's where you have individual participants, but they're within a cluster, within a hospital, within a ward, within a classroom, whatever it is, and the whole cluster gets randomized, not individual participants being randomized. So if it says patients were randomly allocated within a cluster, that's fine for random allocation, provided the clusters are allocated the treatments randomly. But all the other items on the scale, the unit of analysis is participants. And so in item 4, baseline comparability, you need to look for data of comparability of individual participants, not comparability of clusters. And item 8, that's the 85% follow-up. You need data on the number of individual participants followed up, not the number of clusters followed up. Okay, sorry about all that droning on, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of those items. It looks as though some things are being put into the chat. I'm not sure whether I should stop sharing or not. Perhaps, Nicholas, if you can have a look at the chat and read out the question or call on someone to say their question, then I can perhaps scroll backwards and forwards through the slides if needed. So just leave that up for the moment.
So I think there's 2 questions, one from, I think, Elif. So in item 8, if there are more than 2 follow-up measurements in the study, is a 15% loss in just one of them sufficient to indicate no?
No, because it's 15% loss to follow-up at any time point in the study. So even if it's the end of the intervention period is the only time that there was greater than 85% follow-up, and then in the post-treatment follow-up assessment time points, there might be multiple ones of those. They can all go less than 85. But if there's at least one time point, obviously not baseline, but one post-intervention time point when at least 85% was followed up, that's acceptable.
Thanks. From Stefania. So in my experience, almost all the RCTs of the last 20 years comply with items 10 and 11. Am I wrong?
It's certainly very high. They're about the highest of all the criteria on the chart of what's achieved and not achieved. Yeah, there's probably still occasional really low quality trials where one or perhaps both of those things might be missing. But yes, they're nearly always a yes. Hopefully it's fairly quick and painless to identify that. Certainly with the point measures and variability, a trick I use is always to try and go for dichotomous outcomes first, because that's usually quick and easy to see the total N and the number who experienced the outcome of interest. So that's often quicker and easier to score. I don't know, Geraldine, if you've got any comment on that. I guess you're sort of, Stefania is perhaps hinting that maybe we don't need to keep rating those criteria.
So they seem to comply, and I think most raters seem to agree that they do meet. But given that it is part of the scale, we do ask people to rate it.
And I think that was all in the chat, but if anyone wants to add anything else, they can. One question is probably a more general question, but I guess what are, common mistakes you might see when I don't know, people are, or like raters are, submitting their ratings?
Perhaps Geraldine might be better to answer that than me.
Oftentimes it's quite tricky to locate exactly where people are talking about. So I think having more clarity in the location would be great. So I think items 1 and 4 are tricky because you've got to make so many decisions in order to meet the criteria. So as Mark was saying, with with item 1, and the source, it's not just the location of where participants come from, but it's also how they're sourced as well. So there are lots of decisions, and I think people often jump at just looking at the location without considering could this be replicated. And similar for item 4, where you've got to be looking at the severity as well as the other outcome of the condition.
I've got a new question from Raphael. Regarding blinding of assessors, if the primary outcome is self-reported, that is, the participants is the assessor, but all the other outcomes were objective assessment outcomes blinded to the assessor with paper score a no.
Look, it depends if you think any of the other criteria qualify as key measures of the clinical effectiveness of the intervention. So that I guess the answer is the paper would still score a no, unless you really think that the authors haven't adequately sort of identified what the key outcome measures are. If you're convinced that some of the other outcome measures are key measures of the clinical effectiveness, then you could say that.
I guess another question I had was, has the quality of studies improved at all since the implementation of PEDro ratings, or has that been quite stable?
Yeah, so it's improving, but slowly. So it improves on average about 0.5 point on the PEDro scale every decade, which is disappointing for us, but at least it's going in the right direction. And Geraldine and I actually presented a paper at not the most recent Tokyo World Congress, but the one before, just pointing out that concealed allocation and intention to treat analysis are very achievable, even with a very low budget, no budget trial. These are very simple and easy to achieve, and yet still a large proportion of research groups don't achieve them. And so they're ones where we really could lift our standards of research quite quickly, easily, relatively cost neutral, just by people being aware of them. So, yeah, that's an area where we'd like to see things improve.
Yeah, I think we've got a new question from Anu. It's a query about, I think, intention to treat. So in the example you gave, if subjects withdrew and analysis was done for the remaining, is that a violation of intention to treat?
No. So if subjects withdrew from the study, they said, I don't want to be in this study anymore, and so they're not available to be measured, then you can't measure them. But if everybody else that is available to be measured, if the researchers measured them and analysed them in the groups to which they were originally randomised, then it's a yes for intention to treat analysis. So if you think about it, that's why follow-up and intention to treat analysis are two separate items on the scale. Follow-up is one thing, but if they can't be followed up, then you measure them and analyze them in the groups to which they were originally randomized. Does that make sense?
Just while there's a pause, while people are thinking about more questions, I'll show that very cool graph that that we presented about the change in satisfaction of each item over time. And so hopefully you'll be able to see my screen. Can you see that? Should be able to see a graphic of a moving graphic. Can you see that?
Yeah, it's working.
So you'll see along the top is the decade and all the items along the left-hand side, and the proportion of records that met the PEDro criteria by percentage of records indexed. A picture tells 1,000 words, doesn't it? All right. I'd also like to thank everybody for coming, and just if anybody isn't a current rater, and obviously everybody has been a rater at some point, but if you're not a current rater and you'd like to start rating again, yeah, we'd welcome you to start. So just send me a message or message me in the chat or anything like that. And Nicholas, did you want to say anything about the Facebook group?
I think it's a good way for everyone to stay connected, and I think we're trying to, I guess, get people, I guess, a bit more engaged in it. So I think feel free to like add a comment, or if you want to post, I guess, your own kind of, whether it's questions or anything else you want to share. I think we encourage it, and we'd be happy to just to, I guess, stay connected that way. And I guess if anyone has any other questions, that's one way you can, I guess, ask, or I'm not sure if, I guess, you can always email us as well.
That's fantastic. And it'd be great to continue conversations about things that maybe you've gotten out of the webinar today, and maybe to share it on the chat group within the Facebook group.
Definitely. And thanks to Mark for their very insightful presentation as well, and to Geraldine for the same as well. And hopefully we can maybe do another one another time if people need a bit more of a refresher, or if there's any other topic as well that people would like to discuss.
Geraldine, I wonder if it's just worth reminding people about the representative roles and if they might know someone who'd make a good representative. So we've sort of launched a new kind of affiliated position with PEDro, which is called a PEDro representative. And we're looking for people who are particularly linked in with the hierarchy or the financial side of the national member association. So maybe you're based in Italy and maybe you're not particularly high up in the national member association, but you might know someone who is, or someone who has the ear of that group, because part of PEDro's survival comes from donations from national physiotherapy member organisations. And so we are looking for people who can sort of be a representative of PEDro in those discussions, in those forums. So if you're involved and you have the ear of the people who determine the budget, then by all means let us know. But even if you just know someone who is a bit maybe higher up in that world, then if you let us know their names, maybe we can tap them on the shoulder and ask them if they'd be interested in being a PEDro representative.
I can see that we are to time, but yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks so much, Nicholas, for getting us all together. Yeah, look forward to hearing more thoughts and staying engaged with you. And thanks for the really important job that you do of contributing to the quality ratings in PEDro. But great to see you all. All right then. Have a great day or have a great
You
night.
too.
See you, everybody. Thanks so much.
You.
Thank you. Thank you.